Hello everyone, and welcome to Lumen of Ages. I am the boy who played for empresses, the man who wrote requiems for strangers, the phantom who still haunts the concert halls of the world. They call me a genius, a divine vessel, a tragic figure taken too soon. But behind the powdered wigs and the blinding lights of the Austrian court, who was I truly? My name is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. I was born in the year 1756 in the city of Salzburg. From the age of 3, the keyboard was my entire universe. My father paraded me across Europe like a rare, trained animal. I saw London, Paris, and Vienna before I could properly write a letter. Music flowed through me, not as a choice, but as an inescapable tide. It was a blessing, yes, but also a relentless curse that consumed my waking mind and haunted my sleep. People hear my symphonies and operas and imagine a life of joy and endless laughter. They listen to the magic flute or my Symphony No. 40 and feel the touch of heaven. Yet, my earthly existence was a constant, grueling struggle. I fought against crushing debt, bitter jealousy, and the suffocating rules of the aristocracy. I loved deeply, I spent recklessly, and I composed fiercely, racing against a clock that I always knew was ticking faster for me than for anyone else. In the bitter winter of 1791, at the age of 35, the final curtain fell on my life. The mysterious circumstances of my passing, the unfinished requiem, the unmarked pauper grave, all of it became a dark and enduring legend. But today, I am not here to dwell on the cold silence of the tomb. I am here to pull back the heavy velvet curtain of myth. I invite you to step into my world, to hear the real notes of my life, the harsh dissonance beneath the beautiful harmony, the profound sorrow hiding behind the courtly smiles. Listen closely. The orchestra is tuning in the shadows. The maestro is ready. Let the music finally begin. I remember the biting, unrelenting chill of Salzburg. The year was 1756, January 27th. The winter cold seeped through the thick stone walls of our modest apartment on the Getreidegasse. The air inside was heavy, carrying the distinct smell of burning pine wood, damp wool, and the sharp acidity of cheap wine. My father, Leopold, a man whose ambition was as sharp as the frost clinging to our window panes, loomed like a shadow over my wooden cradle. He smelled perpetually of dried ink, old parchment, and a bitter, pungent snuff that always made me sneeze. The world I was thrust into was never one of silence. From my very first breath, my reality was constructed entirely of sound. It was filled with the frantic, scraping friction of rosin on violin strings, the muffled, rhythmic thud of heavy boots on uneven wooden floorboards, and the distant, echoing, metallic chimes of the grand cathedral bells marking the passing hours. Before I possessed the ability to speak, I listened. I listened to the fierce alpine wind howling through the narrow, cobbled alleys, transforming it into a chaotic symphony of woodwinds and brass within my fragile, developing mind. I clearly remember my older sister, Nannerl. She was older by exactly 5 years. I would sit for hours on the freezing, drafty floor, my small knees pulled tightly against my chest, watching her practice the harpsichord. The mechanical sounds the instrument produced fascinated me beyond measure. One fateful afternoon, when I must have been no more than 3 years old, I pulled my tiny frame up onto the worn leather bench. The walnut wood of the instrument was perfectly smooth and terrifyingly cold beneath my small, pale hands. My fingers trembled slightly. I struck a single ivory key. A solitary, resonant note floated upward, slicing through the dusty, stagnant air of the sitting room. Then, I struck another. I frantically searched for the intervals, the sweet thirds, the perfect fifths that my ear craved. The ugly dissonance frightened me, making my heart race, but the harmony, oh, the pure, ringing harmony felt like a warm, desperate embrace. My father heard the notes from his study. I recall the heavy, urgent thud of his boots rushing down the corridor, bursting into the room. He did not scold me for touching his precious instrument. Instead, his dark eyes, usually narrowed with financial worry and strict discipline, widened with a terrifying, all-consuming hunger. "You have the gift of Almighty God, Wolfgang," he whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of awe and avarice. From that exact second, my childhood ceased to belong to me. It belonged entirely to the music, and by extension, it belonged eternally to him. By the tender age of 6 years old, the rocking wooden carriage became my only true home. To this day, the phantom scents haunt my memories. I can still sharply smell the rotting, cracked leather of the interior seats, the sour, pungent sweat of the exhausted carriage horses, and the damp, moldy straw we furiously packed around our feet in a futile attempt to keep them from freezing black. The roads of 18th century Europe were remarkably unforgiving, deeply rutted, plagued by highwaymen, and thick with sucking mud. We traveled ceaselessly for days, then weeks, then months. We rode to Munich, to Vienna, to Paris, across the English Channel to London. I was transformed into a performing puppet, a tiny, exhausted doll clad in stiff velvet and scratchy lace, designed specifically to entertain the powdered, glittering nobility of Europe. I vividly remember the year 1762. We were summoned to Vienna, to the impossibly grand palace of Schönbrunn. The air in the vast imperial hall was overwhelmingly thick with the suffocating, heavy perfume of 100 gazing aristocrats. It was a dizzying mixture of sweet rosewater, heavy musk, and the foul, underlying stench of unwashed human bodies carefully hidden beneath layers of expensive, rustling silk. I walked slowly across the highly polished marble floor, the sharp click of my small, buckled shoes echoing loudly in the vast, gilded, mirror-lined chamber. Empress Maria Theresa sat upon her magnificent throne, a towering mountain of gold brocade and sparkling diamonds. She smiled down at me, but her piercing eyes were incredibly cold, assessing me precisely like a prized, expensive stallion at an auction. My father handed me my small, custom-made violin, and then, with theatrical flair, he tightly bound a silk handkerchief over my eyes, blindfolding me. "Play, Wolfgang," he commanded, his voice echoing in the dead silence. The sudden darkness was an immense relief. Without the glaring, judgmental eyes of the court bearing down upon me, I could finally see the music clearly. I physically felt the taut strings beneath my raw, calloused fingertips. I played a complex sonata, my bow biting fiercely into the catgut, drawing out soaring, mournful melodies that felt far too large and ancient for my small, aching chest. When I drew the final, sweeping stroke, the silence in the room was absolute, heavy, and profound. Then, a deafening roar of applause washed over me like a sudden, violent, crashing storm. The Empress called me forward. I climbed clumsily onto her lap, instantly smelling the suffocatingly heavy lavender powder plastered thickly on her skin, and I kissed her painted cheek. The entire court gasped in theatrical shock. They called me a miracle, a divine Wunderkind, a boy kissed by the angels. But when the massive, carved oak doors finally closed behind us, and we returned in the dead of night to our freezing, miserable inn, the illusion vanished. I was just a profoundly tired, chronically sick little boy. I coughed into my handkerchief until my throat bled raw. I burned with violent fevers that made the dark shadows dance and contort like hideous demons on the peeling, yellowed wallpaper. My father would wipe my burning brow with a cold, damp rag, murmuring fervent prayers, but I always knew he prayed not just for my mortal life, but desperately for his golden investment. The music in my head never stopped, not even when my frail body begged for the mercy of sleep. I wrote my very first symphony when I was only 8 years old. 8. A time when other normal children joyfully chased wooden hoops in the bright sunshine. I was locked indoors, chasing elusive, tormenting melodies in the dark, desperate to keep the terrifying, deafening silence at bay. But the profound tragedy of a celebrated child prodigy is that the child must, eventually, grow into an adult. the cute, velvet-suited monkey holding a tiny violin stretched painfully into a pale, socially awkward young man. The royal courts that once eagerly showered me with heavy gold watches, jeweled snuff boxes, and endless flattery now looked at me with bored, polite indifference. The novelty of my youth had completely evaporated. By the time I reached my early 20s, I was desperate for a respectable appointment. My father, driven mad by our fading fortunes, sent me away to the French capital. The year was 1778. I was 22 years old. My father refused to leave his post, so he sent my beloved mother, Anna Maria, to watch over me and manage my affairs. Paris was a filthy, incredibly loud, and entirely heartless beast. The winding streets reeked aggressively of open, flowing sewers, rotting cabbage, and damp decay. The arrogant French nobles had absolutely no time for a grown, struggling former prodigy from Austria. They were entirely consumed by their own shallow, endless debates over rival operatic styles. I dragged my heavy, mud-caked boots through the endless sludge of the city, knocking on grand doors, offering brilliant symphonies, and giving tedious piano lessons to the untalented, giggling daughters of wealthy merchants who cared solely for the elegant look of my hands on the keys, completely ignoring the profound sounds they produced. And then, amidst the artistic rejection, the true, unspeakable horror began. My mother fell gravely ill. Our miserable, cheap rented room on the Rue du Gros Chenet was incredibly damp, the decaying plaster walls literally weeping with icy moisture. I sat helplessly by her narrow bed for 14 agonizing, endless days and terrifying nights. I can still clearly hear the terrible, wet, rattling sound of her labored breathing, each shallow gasp a desperate, losing fight against the heavy fluid slowly filling her lungs. The distinct smell of mortal sickness, nauseatingly sweet and metallic with decay, permeated my woolen clothes, my hair, my very tortured soul. I held her frail, wrinkled hand. It was so impossibly cold. I whispered lies to her. I promised her we would pack our trunks and go home to the mountains of Salzburg tomorrow. On the 3rd day of July, at exactly 10 o'clock in the evening, the terrible rattling suddenly stopped. The heavy, suffocating silence that immediately followed was the most crushing, absolute silence I have ever experienced in my entire life. I was entirely, terrifyingly alone in a massive, foreign city, staring blindly at the lifeless, gray face of the only woman who had truly loved me without demanding a performance in return. I had to arrange the grim funeral alone, haggle bitterly with greedy, grave-digging peasants, and write the most incredibly difficult, heartbreaking letter of my life to my father in Austria. His response was devastating. He blamed me entirely. In his blind grief and rage, he accused my selfish negligence and my failure to secure a high-paying job of killing her. That specific wound, that jagged, infected, festering cut of guilt and paternal betrayal, never, ever healed. I buried my sweet mother in a dark, foreign, unmarked plot in Parisian dirt, and a massive, vital piece of my youthful spirit died and was buried right alongside her. I returned to Salzburg a broken, bitter man. The town felt exactly like a stone prison, its towering, gray mountains physically blocking out the warmth of the sun, its incredibly provincial, small-minded society actively stifling my creative spirit. I was forced, out of sheer financial desperation, to serve the arrogant Archbishop Colloredo. The man profoundly detested me, and the burning hatred was entirely, fiercely mutual. I can still vividly picture his sneering, powdered face, constantly smelling of stale red wine, heavy incense, and unearned authority. He treated me no better than his lowly cooks or his illiterate stable boys. "Write a mass for Sunday, Mozart," he would lazily order, waving a fat, heavily ringed, manicured hand in my face. "And keep it brief. I absolutely refused to sit in the freezing, drafty cathedral for more than 45 minutes. My blood literally boiled in my veins. I poured my furious, silent frustration into the very notes, weaving incredibly complex, mathematically defiant, and fiercely independent counterpoints that I knew his dull, uneducated ears could never truly comprehend or appreciate. The mounting out, unbearable tension finally snapped completely in the year 1781. I was 25 years old. The final, explosive argument in his grand antechamber was violent, filled with red-faced screaming and flying spit. He called me a rogue, a worthless scoundrel, a miserable lump of conceit. I screamed back that I would no longer be his groveling servant. The Archbishop's ruthless steward, Count Arco, violently grabbed me by the delicate lace collar of my coat. The man's breath was sour with onions, his physical grip like a heavy iron vice. He literally dragged me across the polished floor to the heavy oak door and physically kicked me forcefully in the rear, throwing me violently out into the dusty street. The sharp, physical pain of hitting the cobblestones was absolutely nothing compared to the blinding, white-hot rage that consumed me. But underneath the burning anger, as I lay in the dirt, there was something else entirely. A terrifying, beautiful revelation. Freedom. I was finally, utterly free. I slowly brushed the dirt from my torn breeches, took a massive, deep breath of the crisp, biting Austrian air, and firmly turned my face toward the glorious city of Vienna. Vienna, the undisputed capital of music, of grand, sprawling theaters, of clinking crystal wine glasses in smoky, raucous taverns. The vibrant air of the city smelled constantly of roasted game meats, sweet, warm pastries, and the intoxicating, dizzying scent of endless possibility. I immediately moved into a small, cluttered room rented from the chaotic Weber family. And it was exactly there, amidst the loud shouting and flying flour of their kitchen, that I found my true salvation. Constanze. She was not considered a great classic beauty by the cruel, exacting standards of Viennese society, but to my weary eyes, she was utterly radiant. I remember the very first time I truly, deeply noticed her. She was quietly humming a simple, beautiful Austrian folk tune while patiently mending a torn linen shirt. The warm afternoon sunlight caught the dancing dust motes around her thick, dark hair, transforming them into a glowing, angelic halo of spun gold. She smelled intoxicatingly of sweet vanilla, warm skin, and freshly laundered, sun-dried cotton. I quietly sat at the small, out-of-tune clavier in the corner and began to softly improvise a complex counter-melody around her simple humming. She stopped mending and looked up, her large, dark eyes instantly sparkling with a sharp, mischievous intelligence. We both laughed out loud. It was a pure, ringing, honest sound that instantly cut through the lingering, suffocating darkness of my past tragedies. I loved her with a fierce, desperate, all-consuming passion. My father, predictably, was furiously opposed to the union. He wrote endless letters dripping with toxic venom, cruelly calling her a lazy schemer, a worthless tramp, a fatal distraction from my divine, God-given purpose. For the very first time in my entire existence, I defied him completely and without regret. On the 4th day of August, in the year 1782, we were joyfully married in the magnificent, echoing cathedral of St. Stephen. The thick, burning frankincense made my eyes water profusely, but as I gently slipped the simple gold ring onto her trembling, warm finger, my damaged heart literally soared. We were incredibly, terrifyingly poor, but we were deliriously, insanely happy. We would physically dance around our incredibly small, freezing apartment in the bitter depths of the Viennese winter mornings, moving frantically just to keep our blood flowing, laughing wildly until our ribs ached and tears streamed down our faces. But the universe demands a cruel, balancing rhythm. God generously gave us 6 children, 6 beautiful, fragile, perfect little souls. And the unforgiving earth violently took 4 of them back. I stood completely shattered in 4 separate muddy graveyards, the freezing, relentless rain mixing seamlessly with my hot, blinding tears, intensely listening to the horrific, hollow, thudding sound of wet dirt hitting tiny, cheap wooden coffins. Each unimaginable loss viciously tore a massive, bleeding hole in Constanza's fragile heart and added a heavy, incredibly dark mourning chord to my compositions. The sorrow was a physical, crushing weight pressing constantly on my chest, frequently threatening to stop my breathing entirely. I actively poured that unbearable, suffocating grief into my slow adagios, literally translating the desperate midnight weeping of my heartbroken wife into the weeping, sustained cries of the violins. Yet, alongside the devastating personal tragedies, my mind was constantly, brilliantly on fire with musical creation. The notes poured out of my brain significantly faster than my cramped, aching hand could possibly write them down on the parchment. I fortuitously met Lorenzo da Ponte, a brilliant, exiled Italian poet with a highly scandalous reputation and a sharp, cynical mind. Together, working through the night, fueled by black coffee and cheap tobacco, we crafted The Marriage of Figaro in the year 1786. I distinctly remember the chaotic opening night at the Grand Berg Theatre, the deafening, discordant noise of the massive orchestra desperately tuning their instruments in the pit, the sharp, piney scent of crushed rosin, the heavy, dusty musk of the massive velvet stage curtains, and the faint smell of nervous sweat from the singers. I stood proudly at the conductor's podium, a thin baton gripped tightly in my sweating hand, my heart hammering violently against my ribs like a trapped bird. When the frantic, whispering overture began, the energy in the crowded room was undeniably electric. The noble audience, completely accustomed to stiff, boring, formal Italian operas, was initially shocked, then totally, helplessly captivated by the subversive, brilliant, lightning-fast comedy. We triumphantly followed it with the dark masterpiece, Don Giovanni, in the year 1787. Ah, Don Giovanni, the demon of my own creation. I famously wrote the terrifying overture the very night before the grand premiere in Prague. Constanza sat loyally beside my desk, constantly feeding me hot, spiced punch and telling me ridiculous, funny stories to keep my heavy eyes from closing. The dark, black ink was literally still wet and shining on the pages when the panicked musicians frantically placed them on their wooden stands in the pit. As the opening, terrifying minor chords of the Dead Commendatore violently crashed through the theater, shaking the very floorboards, I physically felt the entire audience gasp and hold their breath in sheer terror. It was a triumph, a glorious, immortal, resounding triumph. But a brilliant triumph written in musical notes does not automatically translate to a practical triumph in heavy silver coins. Despite the thunderous applause and the endless bravos, the tight-fisted emperor's court paid me a miserable, insulting pittance. We lived in a terrifying state of constant, humiliating, grinding financial panic. I wrote endless letters, pathetic, begging letters, to my brother Mason, Michael Puchberg. I completely demeaned my character, desperately pleading for just 100 florins, then 50, then a mere 10 just to buy firewood. The deep shame literally tasted like dry ash in my mouth. I would aimlessly walk the elegant streets of Vienna, my empty stomach violently gnawing with sharp hunger pains, my expensive, bright red velvet coat carefully buttoned to hide the heavily fraying, pathetic threads of my worn linen shirt underneath. The glaring disparity between my immortal, divine musical genius and my wretched, starving reality was a cruel, endless joke played heavily by the laughing heavens. Then came the final, fatal year, 1791. I was only 35 years old, but I physically felt like a battered, dying old man of 80. My mortal body was rapidly betraying me. I suffered endlessly from terrible, blinding headaches, a persistent, rattling cough that tasted of iron, and a deep, bone-wearying exhaustion that no amount of sleep could possibly cure. But the relentless music in my head would absolutely not let me rest. I poured my final, desperate bursts of creative energy into the magic flute, desperately hoping for a popular success to save my starving family. but the dark shadow was already creeping up silently behind me. It began in the stifling, oppressive height of summer. A heavy, rhythmic knock on my wooden door. I slowly opened it to find a tall, exceptionally thin man, dressed entirely in ash gray, his gaunt face deliberately hidden in the dark shadows of the dimly lit hallway. He smelled intensely of cold autumn rain and freshly dug earth. He silently handed me a sealed, anonymous letter, formally commissioning a Requiem Mass for the dead. The promised payment was incredibly generous, handed over immediately in heavy, clinking silver coins. But as the silent man turned and walked away, his heavy leather boots making absolutely no sound on the wooden stairs, a sudden, paralyzing, cold dread violently seized my spine. I was already gravely sick. My mind, deeply feverish and tragically overworked, twisted reality into a nightmare. I became absolutely, terrifyingly convinced that the Gray Messenger was a literal emissary sent directly from God. I weeping told Constanza, my voice shaking with pure terror, that I was actively writing the Requiem for my own impending funeral. The mysterious illness finally took complete hold with terrifying, unstoppable speed in late November. My joints swelled horribly until my pale skin felt tight enough to literally burst open. The physical pain was absolute. A blinding, white-hot, screaming agony that made it completely impossible to move, to even turn slightly in my sweat-soaked bed. My hands, the brilliant, magical instruments of my very soul, became useless, swollen, agonizing lumps of flesh. The dark, claustrophobic room smelled intensely of sharp vinegar, constantly applied to my burning forehead in soaked rags. And the horrific, metallic tang of the dark blood the foolish doctors repeatedly bled from my veins in a completely futile attempt to cure me. The literal taste of approaching death was a sour, thick, yellow coating on my dry tongue. I lay paralyzed in the bed, my breathing incredibly shallow and incredibly fast, staring blankly at the cracked ceiling. The physical silence of the sick room was deafening, but inside my feverish mind, the massive orchestra was fiercely, loudly raging. The terrifying Dies Irae violently crashed like cannon fire in my bursting skull. The sorrowful Lacrimosa wept its incredibly bitter, desperately descending, weeping tears. I frantically dictated the complex notes to my loyal pupil, Süssmayr. I weakly sang the heavy drum parts, my once clear voice reduced to a weak, pathetic, rattling croak. Hot tears continually streaming down my swollen, burning face. I could clearly see the final, triumphant, heavenly chords, the glorious, peaceful resolution hovering just out of my physical reach. On the desperately cold night of the 4th of December, the burning fever suddenly broke into a freezing, clammy, cold sweat. The physician, Dr. Closet, stood silently over me. I weakly saw him slowly shake his head at my beloved Constanza. She threw herself violently onto the edge of the bed, her weeping a ragged, tearing, utterly heartbreaking sound. I desperately tried to lift my useless hand to gently touch her tear-stained face, to tell her that the divine music never really stops, that it merely transitions and safely changes key. But my heavy arm would absolutely not obey my final command. The dark, creeping shadows in the corners of the small room suddenly grew much longer, much darker, silently stretching out their cold arms to finally embrace me. The final, tragically unfinished measure of the Lacrimosa endlessly echoed in the vast, empty void of my fading consciousness. A single, beautiful, perfectly unresolved note hung suspended in the freezing air. Then, the heavy velvet curtain fell. The silence that followed was unlike any silence I had ever known. For 35 years, my mind was an endless symphony of colliding chords, soaring arias, and intricate fugues. Even in my sleep, the music never truly stopped. But now, as the heavy velvet curtain of my mortal existence settled upon the stage, there was only a profound, echoing stillness. I watched from somewhere beyond the physical realm as my beloved Constanza wept by my lifeless shell. I wanted to reach out, to compose one final, comforting melody for her sorrow, but my hands were no longer bound to the earthly instruments of creation. I was no longer a man of flesh and bone. I had become the very music I had chased my entire life. They say a man is measured by the echoes he leaves behind. As I drifted into the eternal void, I could hear the faint, mournful strains of my unfinished Requiem. The Lacrimosa, that tearful lament, would be completed by another hand, yet its soul would forever remain mine. It is a strange irony that the Mass for the Dead became my own usher into the afterlife. I composed for emperors and kings, for the raucous crowds in the lively theaters of Vienna, and for the quiet, sacred halls of Salzburg. I gave them every ounce of my spirit. Over 600 compositions poured from my soul into the world. Symphonies, operas, concertos, and sonatas. Each note was a piece of my heart, freely given, desperately poured onto the parchment before the candle burned down. History, I suspect, will paint me as a vessel of divine inspiration, a miraculous child who plucked melodies directly from the heavens. They will speak of the grand triumphs, the glittering courts of Europe, where a little boy dazzled the nobility with a miraculously skilled touch on the harpsichord. But they will seldom understand the relentless, consuming fire that burned within me. The music was both a divine gift and a heavy master. It demanded to be heard, pushing me to the brink of exhaustion, driving me through illness, poverty, and despair. I lived a life suspended between the brilliant light of pure genius and the crushing shadows of human frailty. I was a man who loved deeply, laughed loudly, and feared the looming specter of poverty. Yet through it all, the music was my salvation, my truest voice in a world that often failed to listen until it was far too late. Now, as the centuries unfold before my spirit, I see that the music did not die with me in that small, damp room in Vienna in the year 1791. It blossomed. It took flight across oceans and continents, transcending the boundaries of time and language. When a solitary pianist touches the keys in a quiet room, I am there. When a grand orchestra swells with the joyful overture, my spirit dances among the strings. I have conquered the grave, not through the preservation of my frail body, but through the eternal resonance of harmony and emotion. My melodies have become the soundtrack to human joy, sorrow, love, and triumph. I am no longer a mere mortal man. I am the enduring sound of the human soul reaching toward the infinite. Do not weep for my early departure, for I lived 1,000 lifetimes within the measures of my scores. The final note may have been left unresolved on my deathbed, but the symphony of my legacy plays on, forever seeking the perfect cadence in the hearts of those who listen. The journey of my life ends here, in the quiet shadows, but the journey of my music has only just begun. Thank you for traveling through history with us. Subscribe to Lumen of Ages for more tales.